Lauren Mitchell vanished without a trace on a quiet autumn morning, and 6 months later, her husband Daniel Mitchell was found dead in a jail cell, taking with him secrets that would unravel a far darker truth than anyone imagined. Lauren Mitchell was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered. At 34, she had built a comfortable life in Charleston, South Carolina. She worked as a marketing executive at a regional health firm, loved hiking on weekends, and was known for her dedication to clean living and mindfulness. To her friends and co-workers, Lauren seemed grounded, focused, and genuinely happy. Married for nearly 9 years to Daniel Mitchell, an IT consultant turned freelancer, the couple lived in a modest home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside the city. They had no children, but often talked about trying for one soon. Everything about them, at least on the surface, looked normal, even enviable. On the morning of August 9th, 2023, Lauren followed her usual routine. She made a green smoothie, walked their dog Benny, and headed off to her 11 a.m. Pilates class at a boutique studio she frequented downtown. She was spotted arriving at the studio by a fellow classmate and was later seen leaving just after noon, waving goodbye as she stepped into the parking lot. But from that moment on, no one would see or hear from Lauren again. Her disappearance began as a ripple. She missed an afternoon Zoom meeting, which was unusual for someone as punctual and meticulous as Lauren. Colleagues sent her text messages, all of which went unanswered. By the early evening, her manager called her emergency contact, Daniel. According to him, he hadn't seen Lauren all day and assumed she was working late or out running errands. He waited a few more hours before calling 911 to report her missing. What troubled investigators, even at this early stage, was the fact that he waited nearly 12 hours after she was last seen to report her disappearance. Police began a search that night, starting with Lauren's last known location. Her car was found a few blocks away from the Pilates studio, parked along a quiet side street. The vehicle was locked, but what stood out was that her keys were still inside, resting in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no shattered glass, no blood, nothing to indicate a crime had occurred. Her phone, however, was missing. Using the last known ping from her cell phone, investigators traced a signal to a heavily wooded area on the outskirts of Charleston, near a rarely used hiking trail. Search and rescue teams combed the area with dogs and drones, but came up empty-handed. The terrain was rough and dense, filled with underbrush and winding paths that could swallow even the most seasoned hiker. It was as if Lauren had vanished into thin air. Local media quickly picked up the story, featuring Lauren's smiling photo on the evening news and across social media. The public responded with concern. Volunteers showed up to assist with the search. Flyers were posted across Charleston. A Facebook page was created to gather information and organize community efforts. Within days, the disappearance of Lauren Mitchell became the focus of a city desperate for answers. Daniel Mitchell made several appearances in front of news cameras. In every interview, he looked broken, tearful, and scared. He described Lauren as the love of his life and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. But behind the scenes, detectives were growing increasingly suspicious. While Daniel appeared devastated publicly, his private behavior raised red flags. For one, he declined a polygraph test. While not admissible in court, the refusal was enough to raise eyebrows. Then there was the matter of the surveillance footage. A nearby gas station captured video of Lauren and Daniel in their SUV at 9:48 a.m. on the day she disappeared. They were arguing. Lauren appeared frustrated, turning her body away from him in the passenger seat. She exited the car alone and walked toward the Pilates studio. Daniel stayed in the vehicle, watching her walk away. Investigators also learned that Daniel had financial troubles. He had lost his steady job the previous year and had been taking on sporadic freelance work, most of which didn't pay well. The couple's joint bank accounts showed recent overdraft fees and a growing number of credit card charges. Yet, despite their finances, Daniel had recently applied for a personal loan using Lauren's name. It was enough to cast a shadow of doubt. Detectives began questioning friends and family, and what emerged painted a very different picture of the couple's life. According to several close friends, Lauren had been unhappy for some time. She had talked about feeling trapped, about how Daniel's mood had changed since losing his job. He had grown withdrawn, sometimes angry, and she didn't know how to reach him anymore. There were no reports of domestic abuse, but there was emotional distance and tension that seemed to be escalating. Lauren had also taken steps to protect herself. A friend revealed that she had opened a separate bank account a few weeks before she disappeared. She hadn't told Daniel. She had also met with a real estate agent to discuss renting an apartment in town. These actions pointed to a woman preparing to leave her marriage, quietly and carefully. Still, no one wanted to jump to conclusions, at least not yet. The community hoped Lauren had simply chosen to leave and would resurface safe. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. There were no sightings, no credit card activity, no social media posts, nothing. A week after her disappearance, the FBI joined the investigation. Digital forensics experts began combing through Lauren's emails, texts, and online accounts. One email, saved in drafts but never sent, caught their attention. In it, Lauren wrote about feeling unsafe and unsure whether she could trust her husband. It ended with a haunting sentence: "If something happens to me, start with Daniel." The discovery gave the investigation new urgency. Police executed a search warrant on the Mitchell home. They found Lauren's journal tucked away in her bedside table. In it were months' worth of entries documenting her deteriorating marriage. She had been afraid of Daniel's unpredictable moods, and the journal hinted at secrets she believed he was keeping from her. Back at the police station, a detective stared at the whiteboard filled with notes and dates, photos of Lauren, maps, and timelines. The picture was slowly becoming clearer. This was no random disappearance. This was something far more personal, and perhaps far more sinister. The first chapter of Lauren Mitchell's story had ended not with answers, but with silence. A woman loved by many had vanished without a trace, and the one person who should have been leading the search, her husband, was beginning to look like the one holding all the missing pieces. As the investigation into Lauren Mitchell's disappearance deepened, the image of her seemingly perfect marriage began to crumble. On social media, she and Daniel had painted a picture of unity, smiling selfies at the beach, date night photos at cozy restaurants, cheerful holiday snapshots. But behind that carefully curated facade, the truth told a different story, one that had been unraveling for months before she vanished. Detectives began piecing together the final months of Lauren's life by speaking to her friends, co-workers, and family members. It became clear that while Lauren had maintained a calm and collected public demeanor, she had been quietly struggling with her marriage. According to her closest friend, Rachel Thomas, Lauren had recently confided that things at home were not good. She'd said Daniel had become distant, easily agitated and withdrawn. He rarely helped around the house, spent most of his time locked in his home office, and would disappear for hours without explanation. The turning point appeared to have come after Daniel lost his full-time job. For years, he had worked for a local tech firm as a systems analyst. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. When the company downsized in late 2022, Daniel was let go. At first, he claimed he welcomed the break and was eager to pursue freelance opportunities. But those opportunities never seemed to materialize. Instead, Daniel sank into what friends described as a depressive fog. He stopped shaving, stopped attending social functions, and began drinking more than usual. Lauren, meanwhile, had taken on more responsibilities. She worked late hours, managed the household finances, and made excuses for Daniel's absence at family gatherings. What made things more complicated was that Daniel refused to admit there was a problem. Whenever Lauren tried to discuss their future or suggest counseling, he either deflected or lashed out. This emotional roller coaster left her feeling isolated and unsupported. Financial records added another layer of tension. Investigators discovered that their joint savings account had been drained over the past several months. Credit card statements showed multiple cash advances and purchases that Lauren never authorized. Expensive electronics, online gambling transactions, and large transfers to unmarked accounts. Suspiciously, some of these transactions occurred during times Daniel claimed he was at home or out applying for jobs. When questioned about the couple's finances, Daniel initially downplayed the issues. He told police they had hit a rough patch, but insisted they were working through it. However, Lauren's private journal entries told a very different story. She had written about her frustration with Daniel's dishonesty and described a growing sense of fear. She suspected he was hiding something, possibly another relationship, or maybe a secret addiction. One entry read, "I don't know who he is anymore. He looks at me like I'm the enemy." Detectives also learned about a new bank account Lauren had opened in her name only. She had deposited small amounts from each paycheck, just a few $100s here and there. But it was clearly a calculated move. A note found in her work planner listed appointments with a real estate agent, a divorce attorney, and a women's support counselor. Lauren had been planning to leave Daniel. The life she had once fought to preserve was now something she wanted to escape. The people closest to her weren't entirely surprised by this revelation. Rachel, her best friend, recalled how Lauren had recently started withdrawing from their weekly brunches. When she did show up, she seemed distracted, her smile no longer reaching her eyes. On one occasion, she told Rachel she was trying to get everything in place, but didn't explain what she meant. Now it was clear that Lauren had been laying the groundwork for a separation. The timing, though, was chilling. All of Lauren's quiet preparations, the new account, the attorney consultation, the house hunting, had taken place within the 3 weeks before she went missing. It was as if she was rushing to put her plan into motion. Investigators began to theorize that Daniel may have discovered her intentions. And if he did, what would he have done? Further complicating matters was Daniel's behavior during the initial search for Lauren. At public vigils, he cried openly, sometimes uncontrollably. He accepted hugs from strangers and thanked volunteers. But those who knew him best said it felt rehearsed, like he was performing grief rather than experiencing it. Privately, Daniel was described as erratic. He missed several meetings with detectives, offered conflicting accounts of his whereabouts on the day Lauren vanished, and once claimed he had gone for a long drive to clear his head, but couldn't remember where he went. One particularly troubling detail surfaced from a neighbor's security camera. On the morning Lauren disappeared, Daniel was seen leaving their house in his car just after 10 a.m. He returned shortly after noon. That 2-hour gap was unaccounted for. Daniel told police he had gone to a coffee shop, but there was no receipt, no digital payment, and no cameras confirming he was there. Investigators marked it as a critical window of time. Then came the discovery of a forged loan application. A bank had flagged a document bearing Lauren's name and signature, submitted just days before she vanished. Handwriting experts later confirmed the signature was not hers. The application listed Daniel as a co-signer and beneficiary. When asked about it, Daniel claimed Lauren had agreed to the loan verbally, but the story didn't add up. Detectives began to suspect financial motive, particularly if Daniel believed Lauren was about to leave him and cut him off entirely. With all this information, the picture of the Mitchell marriage now looked far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. Lauren wasn't just a missing woman. She was a woman trying to break free. A woman who had been living in fear, who had made plans to regain control of her life, and who disappeared at the exact moment those plans began to take shape. Still, despite growing suspicions, police lacked the hard evidence needed to make an arrest. There was no crime scene, no body, no witnesses, but they were closing in. They began tracking Daniel's phone records, retracing his movements, and comparing them with Lauren's final digital footprints. For the first time, they began building a timeline that could connect him directly to her disappearance. The case was evolving from a missing person search into something far darker. Each new detail pulled investigators deeper into a story of secrets, betrayal, and quiet desperation. Lauren had tried to leave, but she never got the chance, and the man who claimed to love her the most was quickly becoming the central figure, in a mystery that had gripped an entire city. 2 weeks after Lauren Mitchell vanished, the public's hope of finding her alive began to fade. Her case, once fueled by community vigils and nightly news coverage, had gone eerily quiet. The leads had slowed, and the searches had yielded nothing. Yet behind the scenes, investigators were working around the clock, and their focus had sharpened on one person, Daniel Mitchell. The once grieving husband was now the prime person of interest, and all signs pointed toward a man with something to hide. The breakthrough came not from the disappearance investigation directly, but from a separate, financial audit prompted by one of Daniel's banks. A suspicious loan application bearing Lauren's name had triggered internal red flags. When the bank contacted her for confirmation and received no response, they escalated the matter to authorities. It turned out Daniel had submitted 3 different applications in Lauren's name, one of which had already been approved. The funds, nearly $30,000, had been deposited into an account he controlled. Police were ready to confront him, but rather than risk a warning, they waited for the right moment. On August 26th, Daniel was arrested outside a hardware store on charges of financial fraud, forgery, and identity theft. His arrest was made quietly, without fanfare or a press release. Investigators hoped to question him further while he was in custody, using the fraud case as a way to keep him in jail long enough to apply more pressure regarding Lauren's disappearance. When brought in for questioning, Daniel was calm, even detached. He admitted to some mistakes, chalking the forged signatures up to desperation. He claimed Lauren had verbally agreed to the loans before she went missing, but couldn't provide any written proof. When pressed about his marriage, he described it as strained but functional. He denied any involvement in Lauren's disappearance and repeatedly stated that he hoped she would return. Yet his answers were vague. his explanations riddled with inconsistencies. Investigators decided to keep him in custody while they built their case. Though they lacked enough evidence to charge him in connection with Lauren's vanishing, the fraud charges were serious enough to hold him without bail. For a moment, it seemed as though time was finally on their side. But then something happened that no one saw coming. 3 days into his incarceration, Daniel was found dead inside his jail cell. A correctional officer conducting routine rounds discovered his body in the early morning hours. He had fashioned a noose from his bedsheets and tied it to the narrow window bars above his bunk. Despite efforts to revive him, Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene. The news of Daniel Mitchell's death spread quickly. The public, already suspicious of his role in Lauren's disappearance, now viewed the suicide as an admission of guilt. Media outlets ran headlines speculating that the pressure of the investigation had finally pushed him over the edge. Others suggested a darker possibility, that his death was part of a broader cover-up. But one fact was undeniable. With Daniel gone, the most critical piece of the puzzle had been lost. In the days that followed, investigators searched Daniel's belongings for anything that might point to Lauren's whereabouts. Most of his personal effects had already been confiscated, but one item stood out, a handwritten letter found on the small desk in his cell. It was addressed to no one, written in vague, cryptic language. The note was not a confession. It didn't mention Lauren by name. But one chilling line near the end caught everyone's attention. "You'll never find her." That single sentence changed the tone of the investigation. If Daniel had taken the truth with him to the grave, the chances of finding Lauren, or even her remains, now seemed painfully slim. Yet the letter also suggested that Daniel had knowledge, perhaps even direct involvement, in her disappearance. It was a taunt, a message designed to provoke. Investigators wondered if the note had been written in despair, guilt, or as a final way to control the narrative. They weren't sure, but they knew one thing: they couldn't give up now. Daniel's suicide also raised questions about jail protocol. The facility where he was held had a standard suicide watch policy for inmates considered at risk, yet Daniel had never exhibited signs of self-harm. He had spoken with a public defender only hours before his death and had not expressed any suicidal thoughts. His sudden action caught everyone off guard. Some speculated he might have feared additional charges, or that he believed his secrets would soon be exposed. Others thought he may have acted to escape consequences, or out of a final, calculated cruelty, to leave everyone with unanswered questions. In the weeks following his death, investigators pored over everything they had: Lauren's journals, Daniel's financial records, digital footprints, GPS data, and surveillance footage. They re-examined witness statements and retraced steps they had already walked a dozen times. They interviewed anyone who had been in close contact with Daniel before his arrest, including co-workers, friends, and a handful of unnamed acquaintances he had been meeting in secret. A few offered small insights, but nothing concrete. Then came a small but significant discovery. A digital forensics expert recovered deleted messages from one of Daniel's cloud storage accounts. In them were emails and chat logs that suggested Daniel had been in contact with someone outside the marriage. An individual police had not yet identified. These communications were brief and coded, but investigators believed they could point toward a hidden relationship or, at the very least, someone who knew more than they had let on. Every new clue seemed to lead only halfway to the truth. It was like piecing together a puzzle with critical parts missing. With Daniel gone, the investigation lost momentum. There were no more interviews to conduct with the prime suspect, no confessions to coax, no secrets to wring out through pressure or time. He had left the game early, and with him went answers that might never be recovered. Lauren's family, devastated and angry, held a private memorial for her, even though her body hadn't been found. Her mother spoke briefly to reporters, describing the pain of not having closure and the torment of knowing that the one person who might have brought peace had taken the coward's way out. The memorial wasn't an acceptance of her death, but a recognition that she was likely never coming home. In the public eye, the case shifted from hopeful mystery to unresolved tragedy. There was no resolution, no justice, no clear ending. Just a missing woman, a dead husband, and a single sentence scrawled in a jail cell: "You'll never find her." What had begun as a search for a missing person had become a haunting story of secrecy, betrayal, and the crushing weight of unanswered questions. 6 months after Daniel Mitchell's death, the search for Lauren Mitchell had slowed to a near standstill. The initial urgency of the case had faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories and fresher tragedies. But behind closed doors, investigators remained committed. They combed through every piece of evidence once more, determined not to let her become just another name on a growing list of the missing. The focus had now shifted to uncovering any associates of Daniel, anyone who might have known his plans, his whereabouts, or held pieces of the truth he had taken with him. Investigators began scrutinizing his digital trail with renewed determination. Among hundreds of messages and online interactions, one particular lead stood out: a set of encrypted conversations between Daniel and a user with the alias Red Echo. The messages had been stored in a rarely accessed cloud folder Daniel had deleted weeks before his arrest. Forensic analysts retrieved fragments of their exchange, revealing cryptic discussions about starting over, hiding assets, and references to a remote property. Though vague, the tone and content suggested that Red Echo might have been helping Daniel plan something significant, possibly even Lauren's disappearance. With no direct identity attached to the username, investigators turned to Daniel's financial records. They noticed a series of payments sent through cryptocurrency wallets linked to anonymous accounts. After months of tracing the digital breadcrumbs, they finally connected Red Echo to a man named Travis Gorman, a former acquaintance of Daniel's from college, who had since moved off the grid to rural Idaho. Travis had a reputation for being reclusive, distrustful of government institutions, and deeply involved in online survivalist communities. He owned a stretch of land miles from the nearest paved road, where he lived off-grid with limited cell reception and no known employment. When authorities arrived at his property with a warrant, he was caught off guard. The search of Travis's property yielded strange results. In one of the sheds behind his cabin, authorities found several items belonging to Lauren Mitchell: her hairbrush, a bracelet her sister had gifted her, and a partially burned duffel bag. DNA testing confirmed the items were hers. The presence of her belongings in such a remote and isolated place ignited a flurry of activity. Investigators feared the worst, but hoped they were finally getting close to the truth. When questioned, Travis insisted he had nothing to do with Lauren's disappearance. He claimed Daniel had visited him months before, asking for a place to store a few things and offering money in exchange for silence. According to Travis, he had no idea what was in the bag or who it belonged to. He said Daniel had returned, only once after that, looking paranoid and agitated. Travis said he hadn't heard from him since. Although his story seemed convenient, Investigators couldn't prove Travis had been directly involved in Lauren's disappearance. They charged him with obstruction and evidence tampering, but were unable to connect him to any crime related to Lauren's fate. Still, the discovery of her belongings reignited public interest in the case and shifted the tone from hopeless to cautiously optimistic. As the property was searched more thoroughly, cadaver dogs alerted near an old root cellar buried behind a hill. Investigators excavated the area and uncovered several decomposing animal remains, but no sign of Lauren. It was another devastating blow. The trail, once again, went cold. Around the same time, an investigative journalist named Grace Whitmore published an in-depth exposé on the case. Her piece, titled "The Woman Who Vanished and the Husband Who Took the Truth with Him," revealed new information obtained from anonymous sources, including emails suggesting Daniel may have been planning to fake Lauren's death in order to collect life insurance money. While no life insurance policy had been filed, Grace theorized that Daniel had been exploring the possibility as part of a broader financial escape plan. The article pointed to another strange detail. Shortly after Lauren's disappearance, Daniel had attempted to transfer the title of their house into his name alone. The document had been blocked due to Lauren's missing status, but it showed how quickly he had tried to cut her out of their shared assets. Grace's reporting suggested premeditation and further supported the theory that Daniel had orchestrated Lauren's disappearance to benefit financially. With renewed public attention came new tips. One caller, identifying themselves only as Sarah, claimed to have seen Lauren at a gas station in a small town 2 hours from where she vanished. Surveillance footage from the location was obtained, and while the woman in question resembled Lauren, the quality of the video was too poor to confirm her identity. No other sightings followed, and the lead quickly fizzled out. Lauren's family remained in limbo. Her sister Jenna became the unofficial spokesperson, urging the public not to forget Lauren's name. She started a non-profit foundation aimed at helping families of missing persons navigate the legal and emotional turmoil of such cases. The foundation's website featured Lauren's photo, case timeline, and a tip line that remained open around the clock. Privately, though, the family wrestled with doubt. Some believed Lauren had been killed. Others held on to the belief that she might still be alive, perhaps being held somewhere or living under an assumed identity. The lack of evidence kept every possibility alive, no matter how unlikely. Meanwhile, detectives began reviewing other cold cases involving missing women in the surrounding states. They were looking for patterns, locations, methods, shared connections, but nothing definitive emerged. Though Daniel Mitchell had become the face of Lauren's disappearance, investigators couldn't rule out the possibility of an accomplice or even another perpetrator who had taken advantage of the situation. The one person who might have known the full story was no longer alive. And despite the items found in Idaho and the mounting evidence of Daniel's deception, the case lacked the one thing it desperately needed: Lauren herself. Without a body, prosecutors could never file homicide charges. Without witnesses, they couldn't confirm abduction. The story hovered in limbo, a tragic mystery punctuated by hope and horror. And every time the case was revisited, it raised the same painful questions. What really happened to Lauren Mitchell? How much did Daniel know? And if he wasn't working alone, who else was involved? As the first anniversary of Lauren's disappearance approached, the town where she had lived began planning a candlelight vigil in her honor. Flyers were posted around town with her photo and the haunting tagline, "1 year missing, 1 year without answers." It was a painful reminder of how little had been resolved, and yet, investigators hadn't given up. With the help of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, they were developing a new profile of the possible movements Daniel had made in the days before and after Lauren's disappearance. They mapped out isolated areas, back roads, and vacant properties within a 100-mile radius. There were still places left to search, still fragments of truth buried under months of silence. What had started as a love story had turned into a mystery, then into a nightmare. And now it stood as a ghostly riddle, one that might never be fully solved. The 1-year anniversary of Lauren Mitchell's disappearance came with gray skies and a soft drizzle that seemed to match the somber tone of the town. Friends, family, and strangers gathered in the local park with candles flickering in the early evening wind. A quiet hush blanketed the crowd as Lauren's sister, Jenna, stepped forward to speak. She thanked the community for their support and reminded everyone that Lauren was more than a mystery. She was a daughter, a sister, and a person who deserved to be found. Behind her brave words, however, was a heavy truth. No one knew where Lauren was, or whether she was still alive. Months leading up to the anniversary, the investigation had continued, but progress had stalled. The FBI's behavioral profile suggested Daniel had likely disposed of Lauren's body somewhere isolated and difficult to access. They believed he had chosen a location in advance, using his knowledge of remote areas gathered through past hiking and camping trips. Investigators mapped out dozens of possible dump sites, old trails and forest clearings. Some were searched with dogs and drones, but nothing conclusive had been found. Then, a break came from an unexpected source. A retired truck driver named Earl Simmons contacted the tip line after watching a documentary recap of the case online. Earl said he remembered seeing a man who looked like Daniel Mitchell at a gas station off a desolate highway near the state border, just one day after Lauren was reported missing. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but the documentary jogged his memory. What caught his attention, he said, was the way the man had been cleaning the back seat of his car with unusual intensity, using towels and something that smelled like bleach. Earl provided a general location, and investigators quickly narrowed it down to a forgotten rest stop off Route 189. The site was overgrown, with cracked pavement and graffiti covering the picnic tables. It had not been used regularly in years. Cadaver dogs were brought in once again, and this time they alerted on an area behind a dense thicket near the edge of the woods. After hours of digging, human remains were discovered. The recovery was slow and painstaking. Bones, scraps of fabric, and a wedding ring were unearthed. Dental records later confirmed what the family feared. The remains belonged to Lauren Mitchell. Forensic examiners estimated she had died within 48 hours of her disappearance. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty due to the condition of the remains, but trauma to the skull suggested blunt force injury. The discovery shocked the community. The case that had haunted them for a year was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy confirmed. Candlelight vigils turned into memorial services. Local news stations broadcast images of Lauren's smiling face alongside the words, "Justice for Lauren." But justice, as many came to understand, would be complicated. Daniel Mitchell was dead. He would never be tried, never confess, never face a courtroom. There would be no cross-examinations, no verdict, no sentencing. For Lauren's family, the absence of accountability was its own kind of torment. While they were grateful to finally lay Lauren to rest, there was no closure in the traditional sense, only an end to the waiting. Even in death, Daniel's secrets continued to unravel. Among his belongings that had been stored by the state, investigators found a second encrypted flash drive. Digital experts cracked the encryption and found a detailed journal of Daniel's thoughts in the weeks leading up to Lauren's disappearance. The entries painted a disturbing portrait, a man unraveling under the weight of debt, resentment, and emotional isolation. He wrote about feeling trapped, about needing a fresh start, and about removing the obstacles in his life. Though he never explicitly named Lauren, the implications were chilling. The journal also contained instructions for someone else, possibly Travis Gorman. The notes mentioned a Plan B and referred to the Idaho property as a safe house. It became clear that Daniel had at least considered the possibility of fleeing and starting a new life. Authorities revisited Travis, hoping to charge him with accessory to murder, but the evidence remained too circumstantial. He continued to deny knowing anything about Daniel's true intentions. The public response to the new information was swift and intense. Online forums speculated about what might have happened if Daniel hadn't taken his life. Some believed he would have eventually confessed. Others thought he had planned everything down to the final detail, including his suicide, to ensure Lauren was never found. The note he left behind, "You'll never find her," now seemed less like a taunt and more like a final mistake. He had underestimated how far the investigation would go. Lauren's story became a symbol, not just of loss, but of perseverance. Her family's refusal to give up, the public's continued pressure, and the relentless work of investigators had brought resolution where there was once only silence. Her sister's nonprofit, now called Lauren's Light, expanded nationally. It offered resources to families of missing persons, helped with search efforts, and advocated for improved protocols in cases involving potential domestic violence. Through interviews and documentaries, Jenna began to speak more publicly. She described the signs she had missed, the gut feeling that something was wrong in Lauren's marriage. She hoped others might listen and recognize red flags in their own lives. She refused to let her sister's death be reduced to just another crime statistic. Meanwhile, the investigation into Daniel's financial dealings continued. Authorities uncovered a web of fraud spanning several states. Fake names, shell companies, and forged documents showed a pattern that extended beyond Lauren. Though no other victims were identified, the scope of his deception painted the picture of a man who had been planning an escape for years. Lauren's disappearance had not been a moment of impulse. It had been the conclusion of a dark and deliberate plan. In the end, Lauren's story did not receive the courtroom drama that many had expected. There were no confessions shouted from the stand, no teary apologies, and no gavel marking the end. But what it did receive was resolution. Her family could finally grieve without wondering. Her name was no longer tied only to uncertainty, but to strength, awareness, and change. Lauren was buried in her hometown cemetery, beneath a tree that bloomed with white flowers every spring. Her gravestone was simple, etched with her name and the words, "Forever loved, never forgotten." At the burial, friends and family placed flowers on her casket, while the community stood quietly nearby, their candles held high one last time. For the town, life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of what had happened never truly faded. The story of Lauren Mitchell remained in the minds of those who had followed it from the start, a haunting reminder of the dangers that can hide behind closed doors and the strength it takes to uncover the truth, no matter how long it takes.